A major part of my upcoming book is discussing or breaking down the different aspects of live service or games as a service gameplay and how it differs from traditional games. So, for this week's Critical Thought, I want to talk a little bit more about what are the three essential gameplay loops, why you do each one right, and if you mess up in any step of the chain, your live service game may be doomed to fail. For a lot of studios out there, live service or games as a service is where the rubber can meet the road. And the games that do really well oftentimes can carry that for months if not years of support. And the ones that don't, they tend to disappear very quickly. And when it comes to establishing your game as a live service title, like I said at the start, you need to consider three different gameplay loops, each one equally important. The first one, of course, is the onboarding or tutorial loop. This is where you're trying to teach the player everything there is about your game, from what are the gameplay systems, how it all works, and of course, where does monetization fall in if it falls in anywhere, whether it's cosmetics, new characters, new maps, etc., etc. This is the point that is oftentimes where a lot of expert players will sneer at. You know, the press here to start a mission, go over here, click this, watch this little video, etc. But this is an important step in any live service game. You do not want to lose people at your onboarding phase, because there's no reason for them to stick around to spend money or keep playing if they're annoyed within 2 seconds of loading up your game. And there are people who have quit live service games within seconds for any number of reasons. Now, for this phase in general, this is a phase where you're going to typically make a lot of rapid progress. For a lot of games that are built around like account levels or leveling up, you can easily skip the first 5 to 10 levels, even more than that, in terms of the progression, just because of how fast you're moving through this. And typically these loops will end with making a purchase on the in-game store. If anyone's played a live service game when you just so happen to get a 6-star or an ultra rare in your first pull. But the point of this loop is that you want the player to understand everything there is about playing the game and to start figuring out whether or not the game is for them. In terms of the duration, this is probably about 30 minutes to an hour, give or take. You do not want a lengthy onboarding, because if you're spending days or weeks trying to teach the player how your game works, they're not going to stick around for that. But one final point before we move on. For games that have content that is locked to specific account levels or progress, you will always need to have mini tutorials or additional onboarding when that content becomes unlocked. And it's typically considered good form that if the player can't access something, do not give them the tutorial for it just yet, because you're just overwhelming them. So with that said, the second loop, and the one that is often where you're going to make or break your game, at least in the early days, is the daily loop. This is what are the minimal things that the player must do daily to keep up with the game. So for a lot of live service games, they will oftentimes go one of two routes. There is the generalized checklist. So for every system in the game, there's often a daily quest associated with it. Play PvP, buy something from the store, do a mission, interact with your friends, do so-and-so, and keep on going. Some games will have this be very specific, that you must interact with every system, while other games will just give you 20 to 40 goals, but you may only have to do 10 or 15 a day. The other option, this is something that we see in competitively driven games, is to have one daily quest, and we can pull up to 2 or 3 quests over the course of 3 days. This is something that we see in titles like Hearthstone, Gwent, Dead by Daylight, and so on, where the quest is something that is randomly chosen, but it's far more specific. Win 5 times as a druid, kill 4 survivors as certain killer in Dead by Daylight, and so on and so forth. I do like it when games allow you to pull quests, so that if, let's say, I don't want to play your game one day, but I want to spend a little bit more time the next day, I can still be rewarded for that day's worth of events. Now, the daily loop again represents the minimal amount of time. And because of that, as I said in my piece about player-friendly design, you want to keep this as short as possible. I would say fairly 20 to 30 minutes, and at most an hour. You do not want to keep extending your daily loop. I've seen some games will do that, where when you start playing, you maybe only need 20 minutes, and then by the end of the game, it now is an hour to an hour and a half of somebody's time. And like I said, this is minimal time. If someone wants to play a game for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, they can do that. But again, this is the amount of time somebody must play. And you want to keep that as fair as possible for the players. Now, with that said, I prefer, again, games that keep things more generalized, have pooled rewards. And this is, again, going to be on a game-by-game basis. So what works in one game may not work for another. Now, the third loop, and this is the big one, because this is what you're going to be spending the most of your development time in if your game picks up, is the long game, or late game, whatever, we can use either phrase here. We're not saying end game, because a live service game is not meant to have an end. And if you run out of content or things for your game to do, or for players to do, your game is most likely going to end up in failure, because people don't want to stick around. This is where the core players convert into your hardcore, and where a lot of your quote-unquote whales will typically reside. Importantly, you want to make sure that people are going to be engaged by this. In the second part of this video, I'm going to be talking about the kind of content you want to look at in terms of your long game. But the long game loop typically begins, I would say, like 3 to 4 weeks out. And I almost forgot this for the daily loop. But the daily loop phase is typically 2 weeks to a month at max. The goal of this phase, or the goal of the daily loop, is that you want to build that investment. You want the player to play this game daily or play whenever they can and leave the game happy each time. When we get to the long game, you've hooked the player with the onboarding and the daily loop. Now it's your job to keep them entertained for months or even sometimes years worth of content. And this is why, for the live service games that do succeed, they will basically convert or dedicate all their time, money, and effort into their long game. Because you want to make sure that your onboarding and your daily loop are as solidified as possible. You don't want to keep changing them every few months or every major update. You want to be focusing on new content, on improving your game, adding new stuff people can experience, and of course, adding stuff for people to spend money on. And when it comes to the long game, this is when you are having to be very economical in terms of your game development. You want to design content that is evergreen, in a manner of speaking, meaning that if I create this content, let's say year 1, if somebody joins my game year 2 or 3, they can experience that content just the same. So this would be stuff like story-driven content, new chapters of your major plot, and stuff like that. But you also want to be considering what content can be introduced that is monetized. This is why for character-driven games like League of Legends, gachas, and stuff like that, there's always a new champion or a new character on the horizon. Because that is the stuff that is game affecting, and it's stuff that can be monetized. Now, in terms of coming up with the pricing for your game, that is beyond the scope for this video today. We are not going to be discussing that. But you want to be looking at content that grows your game, so that your game is fundamentally a bigger experience. Here's year 0, year 1, year 2, and so on. And again, there's a reason why I'm saying years. Because you need to be looking at a live service game in terms of that content. You want to be looking at, what can I do to this game 6 months, 12 months, 24 months down the line? And that means getting into a rhythm in terms of what content you can actually put out. You don't want to be completely killing your developers saying we're going to be releasing 27 new characters every 2 weeks. And that's another major point about live service games compared to traditional titles. You want to give content time to breathe. One, to keep your developers, from killing themselves or their work. And two, you want to make sure players can experience this content. If you spend 6 months a year on some new major event and it only lasts 3 days, well, a lot of people aren't going to be able to experience that, and A, it's going to annoy them, and B, it's kind of like wasted content if it can only be experienced 3 days like that. You want to look at content in terms of your long game that continues to grow and improve your title. And we're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, I want to explore this more, because again, the long game is going to be where, for a lot of developers who are going live service, that is going to become your focus and where these games will live or die. Because if you don't have a long game established, all those core players want to get to whatever is the end of your title, get bored, and leave. And again, as we talk about with live service games, that it's about consistent growth and profit as opposed to spikes. I don't care if month 1 of your game it pulls in $10 million of revenue, when month 2 that drops down to $100,000, and then it drops down even more the next month. So let's take our quick break here, and when we come back, we'll discuss this more. And as always, if you're interested in my thoughts on design, then check out my game design books. For entry-level students, we have 20 Essential Games to Study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with free-to-play coming in 2022. Alright, it's time for the bulk of this discussion. That is, what kind of content goes into the long game of a live service title? And as I said in the last part, this is a major deal. Because if you cannot come up with a solution that is financially viable, that people want to play, and that your developers can handle, you're in deep trouble. When it comes to live service games, the content that you're looking at, you want to think about in terms of these various questions. What can I make? What is content that can extend or expand this game? What can I charge players for? And what kind of time frame can I do this in? And that last point is very important because, again, live service games need consistent content. And when we say consistent, we don't mean you must put out a brand new thing every day or every week. But you want to always be having something new and exciting that is going on, and something new and exciting that is going to be happening. Again, you want to keep players engaged. And that means figuring out what kind of content fits your game, because every game is different. Cosmetics or a new character in one game may not be so important as a brand new story in another. And when it comes to story-driven content, again, that differs based on the game. Path of Exile added in new acts, but they eventually just went to adding in new post-game content. With the game Arknights, they just recently released their, I believe it's chapter 9 worth of their story. And even if your game is competitively driven, you want to have content that everyone can experience in your game. In Dead by Daylight, when they introduce a new killer, you not only get the new killer, you get a new map, you get a new survivor, you get their, I think their new season or their tome challenge. You get stuff that everyone can experience. Because again, the long game of a live service title is about being very economic with your content. You don't want to create a update or a new thing that only 10% of your player base can experience. For live service games that have story-driven events, they will typically design content for new players, for those who are kind of middle-of-the-road average, and of course, super high-level end-game challenging for them. Because you want to make sure that any content that gets added to your game, as many people who are playing your game can experience it, are able to. And this is also why for major events, they will typically run like 2 weeks to a month, sometimes maybe even 2 to 3 months, depending on the game in question. Now, again, in terms of the schedule, this is the other very big point. Like I said at the end of the last part, you need to give content time to breathe, not only for the consumer side, but for the developers. And one of the major things you have to establish very early on, what is your schedule for new content? Do we get a new character every month? Do we get new story content every 2 to 3 months? And once you have established that, you need to adhere to it. And if you have to go later, you need to explain that to people, because you do not want anyone to be questioning whether your live service game is alive or dead. Because then we have the whole evolve situation all over again. And when we say content like this, again, you can have different content for a game. You can have on the smaller scale cosmetics, flavor, stuff like that. On the middle scale, new characters, a new champion. And on the high level scale, new multiplayer maps, new story-driven content, even new game systems. And that is something you need to consider when we talk about the very long game. So that's when a game has been out for a year, 2, 3, 4, 5, even more than that. Look at new systems that you can introduce. Warframe is the king of this example. Over the course of, I think, we had like 7, maybe 8 years, maybe even a little bit more than that in terms of Warframe, they have added in ship-based combat, open world exploration, expanding their guild options, new characters or new warframes, new weapons, new story content. And for them, they, I believe, typically go for once a year in terms of an expansion. And again, let me say that again. Expansion once a year. For a lot of live service games, they will typically do major events, sometimes half-year anniversaries, and of course 1-year anniversaries as well. And you want to, again, design content that can fit this. Seasonal content is another popularity, that they'll have a Halloween event, a Christmas event, New Year's, Chinese New Year's for games developed in the Eastern markets, and so on. And you want to be able to have this content that you can fall back on year-round, so that you will have a schedule of all the major events, all the new things that are coming to your game, stuff that you can convey to your developers so they know what to work on. And again, stuff to convey to the consumer so they know that, okay, if it's October, we may have a New Year's event in 2 months, but maybe we'll have a special Black Friday event as well. Or if it's the beginning of October, maybe there's a Halloween event coming in a few weeks. And like I said, this is where it gets very challenging, because you want to keep adding content to your game. As we've said before, your game should be fundamentally a bigger game year 0, year 1, year 2, and so on and so forth. You should be looking at content that can become kind of the bread and butter of your game. Again, for character-driven games, that's going to be new characters, and that's where a lot of the bulk of their development is going to be focused on. For a game like League of Legends or Dota, they're not developing new maps every few months. But if we're playing a multiplayer-driven game like Dead by Daylight, where the map has a huge impact on what is going on, then that's going to be factored in. And when it comes to long game-based content or long-term content, you have to be understanding what's going to be free, what's going to be monetized. Anything that is gameplay impacting, new systems, new rules, new mechanics, that stuff you should never charge. Because that is the content that is affecting the baseline experience, your core gameplay loop. And if you try to charge for that, you may end up leaving your game in a situation of the haves versus the have-nots. And that's where it gets very unethical and, of course, very pay to win. Now, as you keep expanding your game, again, the risks of this is that if you introduce content that people don't like, it can lead to a lot of churn. And why content like this is often heavily iterated on, very play tested, because when you change your fundamental experience like this, it can have disastrous results. And why this kind of content, again, the game changing one, will happen, it has to happen at some point during your game's life cycle. No live service game, again, should be exactly the same way at year 1 as in year 2, 3, 4, and 5. You need new life in your game. You need new reasons for people to log on. And that's why you need to be very careful about that. And if you have to roll things back, that is, last chance or last choice on your decisions of what to do. So to wrap things up, like I said, when it comes to live service games, you need to be thinking about the onboarding loop, the daily loop, and the long play or the long game of your loop. If any one of those aspects is not right, you are not going to be able to convert people from casual to core to hardcore. Because ultimately your goal as a games as a service or a live service developer, you want to keep people playing for months and years. Maybe not daily, but you want this game to be part of their routine. You want people to want to log into your game. And if you're not thinking about what's going to keep them entertained or any reason for them to spend money or even spend time in it, your live service is not going to do well. And like we said, the games that succeed, it's not about thinking in terms of days or weeks, but months and years. And it's why these games, when they pop off like this, that developer's not working on anything else for a very long time. And as I said in previous talks about gotchas and live service games, the successes become massive if they do it right. Genshin Impact, as I said, and as I talk about in the next book, they earned back their entire development funding, I believe, within 1 to 2 weeks of its release. And it is, I think, considered either the number 2 or the number 3 best-selling gacha game right now. Like, it is pulling in tens of millions of dollars a month for MiHoYo. So they're not hurting anytime soon. So with that said, thank you so much for watching the Critical Thought. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do the liking and subscribing as well. If you have any other topics regarding live service, games as a service, or any other service you'd like me to talk about in a future video, let me know. Check out our Discord and Patreon as well, link down below, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where it's in the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.